Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome. I think most of you know me. My name is Juan Cruz. I'm the Dean of the School of Fine Art. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to this, which is the last in our Visual Cultures lectures for the 2015 and 16 series, which overall is entitled Rise Up and Envision. And tonight we're really delighted and very kind of proud to welcome Marina Warner to speak with us. We originally had intended that Marina would be in conversation with Catherine David, and that would be moderated by Margarita, but unfortunately through some scheduling conflicts, Catherine was unable to be with us tonight. But the good news is that we get more of Marina and Margarita, which I think is very good news. I'm very pleased personally about that. I'll introduce our speakers just in just a moment, but just to say a little bit about the Visual Culture Lecture Series. Many of you are kind of repeat visitors and very loyal visitors. You'll have heard this before, but some of you may have not been before, so I think I'll say something. The Visual Culture Lecture Series for us is our public lecture series, and we think about it very much as the lecture series where we collectively generate knowledge. We program the lectures as a group, as a kind of faculty within the School of Fine Art. And what we try and do is identify people who we want to hear and identify people who we want to help us develop some of the ideas that we're thinking about. The conversations tend to go, well, we're thinking about these things. Who knows more about this than we do? Who could really help us try and figure out whether these hunches that we have are going to come out in anything and whether we can really generate something around these ideas. Last year, we tried to work on a theme of contemporaneity and based the lecture series principally around artists and curators, people directly from the art world who were talking about what their sense of working now was. And we define the contemporary both kind of historically but also theoretically. This year, we've kind of broadened out and expanded our reach a bit. And the lecture series this year is called Rise Up and Envision. And what we've tried to do is to bring speakers from the art world, but also somewhat people who are maybe a little bit more on the margins of the art world. And what we've been trying to do is maybe test some of the assumptions that sometimes come up through art about the kinds of subjects that we might dare to be dealing with. So, for example, we had Airbnb and Bar Vulcan with Castillo Corrales initially talking about the idea of dwelling and habitation and letting and trying to think about the way in which we inhabit property. Nobru Hidano and Suhail Malik talked about economics, the relationship of neoclassical economics to the sort of rather, well, whatever you'd like to call it, economics of the art world. Richard Sennett and Jonas Stahl discussing ideas of participation, democracy, space, and agency. And last week, Adrian Lahoud and David Cunningham discussing a couple of weeks ago, talking about I suppose the relationship of the diagram to the contemporary context, to put it briefly. So in a sense, it's a kind of series that is attempting to generate new knowledge, new ideas, and to give us pause for reflection and also development of our own thoughts. Tonight, Marina, the subject of the talk will be around the Arabesque, which is some new work that Marina's working on at the moment, and it'll evolve in the conversation. So, for introductions, Marina Warner was born in London to an English father and Italian mother. She was educated in Cairo, Brussels, and England, and read French and Italian at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford. She's currently Professor of English and Creative Writing at Birkbeck College, University of London. She's the author of a number of works of fiction and non-fiction. She contributes essays, articles and reviews to newspapers, journals and artist catalogues, and has curated several shows. Much of her writing is concerned with an analysis of mythology with a focus on female symbols. Her novel, The Leto Bundle, in 2001, explores the trials and struggles of a refugee, drawing on mythology, fairy tale, medieval chronicles and contemporary events to examine issues of identity and exclusion, motherhood and survival. Other books include Phantasmagoria, Spirit Visions, Metaphors and Media into the 21st Century, 2006, which explores the idea of spirit and soul since the Enlightenment, Stranger Magic, Charmed States and the Arabian Nights, winner of the Sheikh Zayed Prize, and the work on the Arabesque that Marina will be speaking about tonight is new work, but that image or that idea also appears in that text. And Once Upon a Time, a short history of fairy tale from 2014. A new collection of short stories, Fly Away Home, appeared last year, and I did have a copy of it somewhere. just over here, I've left it here, which is Aura's copy. But I might try and steal it, I think. Yes, so that appeared last year. Marina Warner was made a dame and given the Holberg Prize in 2015. So we're extremely honoured to have you here. Marina will be in conversation with Margarita Gluzberg. Margarita is a reader in fine art, colleague here at the Royal College, where she's been teaching since 2005. Her work spans drawing, performance, sound installation, photography, and moving image. Margarita is interested in consumer capitalism, object desire, and general excess. Margarita, she exhibits her work nationally, internationally, and is currently undertaking a really interesting project called Rock on Bones, which is funded by the Wellcome Trust. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you, Marina, and really delighted that you'll be speaking with us, and then to hear, I think the way it's going to work, Marina's going to speak first, and then that'll be followed by a conversation with Margarita, after which we may have the chance at the end to ask some questions. So thank you very much for being here, and welcome.
Thank you very much for Juan, for a very generous, warm introduction, and I'm very delighted to be part of this extremely stimulating sounding series of talks. I hope I can live up to the precedents set. I also want to thank Anne Dufour very much for arranging it all, and of course Margarita for agreeing to be the interlocutor with our ghost, with Catherine David, the ghost. I did actually hit upon this theme because Catherine David has worked a great deal in the Middle East, and I last, in fact, heard her speak in Dubai. So I thought that we could both engage about questions of gender and power and aesthetics in the context of the current conflicts in the world, centered on the Middle East. But I've now got the stage to myself with Margarita, which is excellent. I have been working, as I often try to do, culturally in relation to the difficulties that are engulfing our world. A recent book has come out by Terence Cave, who's a scholar, a French literary scholar, called Thinking with Literature. And in it he lays out an argument for cognitive reading, which I think can be extended to cognitive aesthetics in general. And one could say not only thinking with literature, but thinking with art. And it has always been my, as it were, my cause that the humanities should precede the social sciences and precede politics in the sense that that it is through the humanities that we envision. So your title is absolutely right. Rise up and envision. It is through the arts that the history of our species shows that we have hit upon our greatest solutions. We have not come at them. We need them to devise laws and devise politics, but within the larger imaginative context. So, and this, of course, has also meant that is there a ground for someone, I mean, the artists actually are much quicker at doing this than writers on the whole, of conceptualizing a current question or current problem in terms of symbolism or the languages of aesthetics, the languages of performance, the languages of that can be beyond language too. So I have been working on a dance piece. I don't know much about dance, but I have a friend, Kim Brandstrup, the choreographer, who knows a great deal about dance, and a musician, Joanna McGregor, who is also a composer and pianist. And together we are making a dance piece. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the origins of that. And it's the main reason why I've chosen this term arabesque. Because as you know, the arabesque is a pose in ballet, an extensive series of poses in ballet, but it was taken into ballet, into dance, from an aesthetic concept that goes back to the Islamic world of the 8th to the 12th centuries and their flowing line. We'll talk about that more. The immediate inspiration for the dance is this book, The Consorts of the Caliphs, which is about the women of the Abbasid court who ruled in Baghdad in the 8th to the 10th centuries, 12th centuries. This guy, who's a historian, Ibn al-Sai, as the caliph, that was the caliphate that's now being invoked by ISIL. As the caliphate collapsed under the onslaught of the Mongols from the east, he thought he would try and memorialize what had happened during this heyday of Baghdad culture. This is the great golden age when the sultans had a scriptorium in which the manuscripts were copied into Arabic, the ancient Greek manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, and so forth, were copied into Arabic, and that is how we have inherited them. There were also numerous other aspects which I won't go into. But this book is about the women whose lives were almost totally forgotten, almost unrecorded. And this is the only trace that we have is in this collection of anecdotes that he compiled. And two things emerge from their condition in the harems and palaces of Baghdad, because these are all women who were brought into high-born families. They were, many of them, slaves. They were, interestingly, from very different religious and racial backgrounds, and that is chronicled. It says this one's black, this one's blonde, this one's Christian, this one's so forth. So, and they were brought in for their gifts, not for their beauty, for their gifts. So two things emerge from the way we think about Islam now. One is that these women who were bought and sold and bartered like slaves and used as sexual objects as we expect were literate. That is absolutely unheard of in any comparison with medieval Europe. The only women who were literate, indeed the only people who were literate in medieval Europe, were people who were emphatically not slaves. So this was one thing that caught my attention. Their poetry, which is mostly poetry, but their poetry is not only love poetry, there's some love poetry, some lyric poetry, but what remains is actually a lot of satire, a lot of quips, a lot of quick epigrams. And part of the survival strategy that they needed was to return very fast with repartee, using rhyme. And it was a custom in the literary world of the past. It actually was a custom in Scotland too, called flyting, where one poet says one thing, another poet responds. So this was a pastime of the court. The second thing that caught my attention, and of course this interested me a great deal because I've always been interested in women's activities. So the second thing that caught my attention is that when these women grew older and ceased to be the playthings and love objects of the sultans, they actually were given honor and they were given palaces and they were covered in jewels and God knows what. They became very rich. This is why we have the traces of them. I'm sure there were many, many who were just vanished into nothingness. But the ones whose names have survived were able to act according to their wishes. And one of the things they did, and this is where my dance piece begins, is they managed water. They looked out of their enclosed palaces at the Euphrates, and they decided, several of them, to build public parks, to build aqueducts, to build bridges over the river, and so forth. They were interested in the supply of water. So, and water has a place in mysticism as an image of nourishment, an image of blessedness, an image of freshness, an image of purity, fertility. I mean, the symbolism of water runs all the way through the Bible for a very good reason. The Bible was written in the Middle East. In Paradise, there are 4 rivers that are, go back to the medieval sources. And this is in Christian symbolism, but the rivers are themselves Eastern rivers because our own culture is entirely embedded and indeed watered by the lyric languages of the Middle East. I've called it, the ballet is called Sor Aqua, and I'll come to that in a minute, Sister Water. So this is an example of a hybrid artifact, where you can see a certain Eastern influence, though it was made in northern France in the 13th century, showing the 4 rivers of Paradise. And this is the Nile, this is the Tigris. I didn't do the other 2, but that was just to play. I mean, I saw it in the Musée de Cluny in Paris, and it struck me that this was a moment when the cultures were in communication, they were entangled. Then one of the earliest poems in Italian, actually in the dialect of Umbria, is St. Francis's most beautiful praise of nature. He doesn't actually mention the Christian cosmology at all. He just says, "Thanks be to you, my Lord, for brother sun and sister moon." And at one point he says, "Thank you, my Lord, for sister water, who is so useful and humble and precious and chaste." And this imagery that comes from the Middle East and is present in the Bible about water and quickening and freshening irrigates Dante's earthly paradise as well. And you can go and see these drawings now at the Courtauld. They're on vellum, and the exquisiteness, this is a dreadful slide, you cannot believe the exquisiteness of this drawing, the lightness, the grace, the dexterity of his pen as it goes over the vellum. And that figure in the middle is called Matilda. We have no idea where Dante found her, who he means by her, but she stands in the earthly paradise dancing and singing. And in the earthly paradise, which is at the top of the mountain of purgatory, according to Dante's scheme of hell, purgatory, and paradise at the top, she presides over two rivers. One river is called Lethe. We're very familiar with that river. That is the river of forgetfulness. And the other river is called Eunoe, good mind, good thinking, good memories. And Dante invented that other river. And I'll just show you Dore's 19th century illustrations. This is Matilda, the spirit of the earthly paradise, singing and dancing in the earthly paradise. She takes Dante the pilgrim by the hair and she plunges him into the waters of Lethe so that he will forget all the dark things that he needs to forget. It isn't, of course, true because he wrote the poem and he remembers all the things he saw in the Inferno. And indeed, he remembers all the appalling crimes that he saw when he was alive, which he's put into the Inferno. So it doesn't work. It's just a symbol that what would happen if one was achieving blessedness, one would achieve some state of partial forgetfulness, partial oblivion. It may be contestable whether that's a good thing, but that's what happens to him. And then she takes him and she gives him to drink of the waters of Eunoe, the waters of good mind. And then he is able to ascend to paradise, to the highest spheres. And in the highest spheres, which you will see if you go to the Courtauld, it's all light. It's just the most marvelous drawings of scintillating points of light, as the airiness and glorious luminous bliss, which is conveyed unbelievably well by Botticelli. So those were my points of departure for the ballet. And in terms of the relation to today, water, I don't need to tell you, has become the resource that we are fighting our wars about. We are fighting for oil, but we are fighting for water. And so in a refugee camp such as this, water is the most precious commodity and very difficult to deliver. In the children's drawings that were done for Save the Children in that camp, the one thing that you see where the children gather, where is this? I mustn't point it in dangerous ways. This is the water cistern. And this is where the children have shown the maximum points of gathering. So I wanted to try and create a ballet out of these issues, out of this. And it seemed to me that I could unify it through the idea of the arabesque. And then I was actually asked by Archangel, and by coincidence, it was really wonderful. I was asked by Archangel to go to Toledo to write a piece about Cristina Iglesias' fountain. That's the river Tagus, which goes around the bottom of the huge crest on which sits the town of Toledo at the top. It is encircled by this river, the Tagus. And the earliest inhabitants of Toledo just found ways of lifting the river water up to supply water to the inhabitants. She's taken this place as her inspiration and created 3 fountains. And I'll come back to those at the end, because they were very important to how I began thinking about the dance piece. So the arabesque. One of the definitions, there's very little written about it, which is always rather exciting when one starts on a new project to find that there isn't an entire library of books to read. But I was actually rather shocked. I mean, I only found 3 articles about arabesque as a language of dance so far. I mean, I'm sure there's more, but and of course there's the dance notation and dance manuals themselves, which I need to look at. But it seemed to me that it was an expression in current use that had not actually, truly been tested and probed. And of course, it also has a slightly diminishing effect. Words ending in esque sometimes have that effect, that they're like slightly like diminutives, like as if it's not so important it's an arabesque, rather than it having a sort of solid, energetic presence, which is what it is aesthetically. So one of the definitions I came across is that it is composed of 2 countervailing energies. One is the jet, the spring, the force, the spurt, so that it is a dynamic line that is springing forth. And the other is, that in Arabic is al-rami. Then the other, which as it were contains it, is al-kai, which means the lace, the bond, the thong, the tie. So basically you have, in something like this 10th century, very characteristic 10th century stonework piece of arabesque, a relief panel from Cordova, you can see how the branching energy of the line of the vegetation is actually springing forth dynamically into the space, but is being contained by the frame, but also is being contained by the discipline of the making itself. So, and Cristina Iglesias is responding to that when we see her later. Similar, this is the sort of tiling patterns. I'm not going to show you many examples because you can find them for yourselves, but also they're complex, and I just want to go through it fairly quickly. This is a very fine example from the Alhambra, where you see again the idea of the containing geometry is actually tethering, almost like a net, is tethering the energy of the repetition, the endless exploding line that is seeking, as it were, to continue. And one of the Alois Riegel, the great historian of architecture from Vienna, was one of the first people to explore the concept of the arabesque, and he said it was about endless correspondence. So you're basically got endlessly generating symmetries, and unless you frame it, unless you contain it in a border, it will go on forever. Riegel felt that was one of the important characters of the arabesque, that it has a kind of tumultuous need to continue. It is, and for this reason, it's associated with Quranic Sufi mysticism, because it is the figured contemplation of the divine power. You don't have figuration, you don't have faces, you don't have representation. You do actually have a bit of it. And by the way, it's not true that the Quran bans images. It's the tradition commentaries on the Quran. The Quran says nothing about images, unlike the Bible, which does ban images. This idea. It's attempting to capture, according to a sort of mystical economy, the endless, infinite repetition and timelessness of the deity. Here's another example. One of the other characteristics of arabesque is that there is no figure or ground. You can look at it one way or the other. Are the colours in front or are they behind? Here, the whites in front or the colours behind. So there's that. The flattened plane, even though the whole surface, the whole area is tessellated, it actually has relief in it because it keeps going in and out. You can choose which way you're going to look at it. one quotation from the Dictionary of Symbolism that I told you about, the jet and the bond or the tie, is the arabesque is not a figuration but a rhythm, an incantation by infinite repetition of the theme, a transcription of mental contemplation, mental remembrance. So this is the kind of mystical side of it. The there are two versions, two basic fountainheads of the imagery. Here you see more geometry. There's not, you could possibly see flowers in this, but on the whole you can't really see flowers. But in something like that, you see vegetation, branches, fruits, and so forth. And the two are connected. And to some extent, this form of the arabesque reaches Europe, reaches Christian Europe, and remains created in Christian Europe more than this kind. One of the ways that the arabesque, one of the forms the arabesque takes is calligraphic. I didn't actually show you any of those, but many of the geometric patterns that you see on the walls of mosques are actually inscriptions from the Quran. And so this is where I think that the dynamic line of the arabesque becomes a form of inscription. And this script, this is one particular script, a slightly later script than the ones, the works I was showing you earlier. But this is my favorite script in Arabic, Nastalik. And here you see, I think, how we're getting very close to the hand dancing on the page as it draws, as it writes. And I hope you're beginning to see that it seems to me that one of the natural forms that is being invoked by the restless patterns and energy of the arabesque in the plane shares something of the quality of water. This to me is very powerfully musical, watery, and I don't just mean that it looks as if we're looking at a stream, which it does in a sense, but I don't mean that. I mean that there's a sense of the sort of rills and freshets and the pulse. You know, we could be looking here at the river of Eunoe, the river of good mind. This is another example. I forgot to say about the women in the courts, the Abbasid courts, is that they were also famous for their calligraphy. It was important for them not only to be poets, but to be able to write beautifully when they wrote down their works. And this one, Mir Emad, he had a daughter who was a famous calligrapher. I couldn't find an example of her work online, but she was a famous calligrapher. I was talking with Margarita earlier, and she's interested in dance notation, she told me. And you see, this is where I've seen a little bit of dance notation, not very much, but when I first saw this, I was very, very struck by how Arabic it looked. I mean, and this is another one. Tessa Traeger, the photographer, actually created these images photographically from Jacobean portraits, and then she superimposed these notation, these scripts that are actually from dance books of the same period as the portraits, trying to make a sequence of, I think, very beautiful, actually, very interesting work. So some of these steps might have been related to the arabesque as a dance step or attitude. It's more of an attitude. But the term, as I mentioned before, only came into use in dance in the 19th century. I took some of these images from the web just to show you. It's a sequence of poses, but the main characteristic it has, and why it must have been called the arabesque, though I haven't found out exactly, someone was commenting on this, is because the figure is fully extended in the arabesque. There's a way in which this is the body at its maximum. If you think of it as tiling a plane or filling a volume, this is the body filling the maximum volume and extending further, implying an extension further into the space. There's also, in some of the literature, Francesca Falcone is the person who's written two sort of major articles on it, an Italian scholar of dance. And she has traced that it's associated with aspiring, with the idea of flight, the idea of lightness, floating, and also with the idea of desire. I'm not going to go more into that, but it seemed to me that it was interesting to look at the Arabic roots of calligraphic motion, calligraphic patterning, in terms of a contemporary dance piece, which would not be danced in this fashion, and it's not going to be danced en pointe. But so there's more of this sort of idea that we've got. This is a wonderful series of photographs taken by Roger André, who was a woman photographer, who was married briefly to Carthage. And she took these, very famous in the annals of surrealism, because it's when André Breton first saw his wife, his future wife, Jacqueline Lombard. She was in a nightclub doing a naked acrobatic dance underwater. I put in a few more because they're so beautiful, though they're not arabesque. She's just swimming, but they're very lovely. But for me, these images have, they continue the affinity between women and water. And I also added the story, the fairy tale from the film La Talente, a film that I love very much and have written about, in which when Juliette has run away from Jean, he remembers that she told him that if he put his head underwater and he truly loved her, he would see her in the water. And when she leaves him, he dives into the frozen canal and opens his eyes, and there she is, a vision in front of him. And it's a marvelous moment in the film. And in some senses, it captures this idea of the affinities between dream, continued life, desire, and the weightless body, which is what the arabesque aspires to lift the body to its greatest extent and its apparent flight, its apparent lightness and flight. So one of the ways that I always try to explore a symbol is to look at it in terms of its technology and its history. And that, as I said, was one of the things that caught my attention about the women in Abbasid, Baghdad. That should say aqueduct, sorry. Zubaydah was the wife of Harun al-Rashid and the daughter of the Vizier Jafar, who, if any of you have seen Aladdin, the Disney Aladdin, will remember is the villain. And she was a historic figure. She was Harun al-Rashid's favorite wife. And when she retired, she made the Hajj to Mecca. And on the way to Mecca, she noticed that the pilgrims had very little water. And so she built an aqueduct. It shouldn't say canal, it's an aqueduct. Although an aqueduct is a form of canal, of course, it's a raised canal, between Baghdad and Mecca, and some of it still remains. It went the whole way, and this is the ruins of it in one part of the road. The Islamic world in the Middle Ages was extremely clever at looking after water. The great book called Hydraulic Despotism, which is about water as opposed to capitalism, it uses water as the metaphor for power, by Karl Wichtwervel. He says that the medieval Europe had not achieved anything like the technology. I mention this because there's so much talk about the backwardness of the Middle East. So it's my attempt to redress these mistakes. This is a wonderful book. It's very difficult to get good images off the web. It seems to be highly copyrighted. It's full of these marvelous images of devices for raising water. They used dowsers, they used water diviners to find where the aquifers were, and then they built these very deep wells with a system of pulleys and wheels to bring it up. And many, many different kinds of I'll just show you one or two. When Napoleon went to Egypt at the end of the 18th century on his great expedition that brought back so much knowledge of the pyramids and the obelisks that we have and we see in Paris, it's not often remembered that he actually was very interested in the contemporary Egyptian state, the modern state, not only in the great antiquities, which is the part that we know about, and this is one of the great drawings engraved in his book, the Description d'Égypte, which is a huge, great, enormous, the elephant folios, vast, vast books, absolutely beautiful. And Cécile and Baltard and de Saint-Maurien, some of these engravers were women, which also interested me, working on translating the engineer's drawings into the engravings which appear in the books. Here you see one of the gigantic water wheels that was used on the Nile to raise the water for Cairo. This is in Syria, still visible, unless it's been bombed, I don't know. The great Noria water wheels, they're magnificent objects, going back to the Middle Ages. I'm sure the mechanism has been renewed, but the concept goes back to the Middle Ages. And it's a smaller version. In this version, the ox is turning a wheel which has got buckets inside the wheel, so the water pours out of the buckets as the wheel turns and picks it up. Similarly, this one, you can see the line of buckets coming down from the water wheel and lifting it later. This is one I particularly like. This is a slingshot version of capturing water. So I don't know if you can see these are buckets. These are buckets, they flick it over into the next bucket, and eventually it goes up this escarpment from the Nile all the way up. They must lose quite a lot on the way, but it's still very ingenious. The water springs rise up naturally from the ground and are contained in cisterns, all these different systems and in the Middle East currently, you can still see the old system of the farage, how the water is collected in sluices and channels to keep the desert irrigated. Here's the photograph I took of the farage in Abu Dhabi. And this is a satellite photograph showing how where there is water, there is growth. But where there isn't water, you see what happens. So then, and returning to the question of symbolism, the water, the headwaters of any system of this kind, of the irrigation systems, is known as the mother. So there's a sense of the flowing of the maternal body to irrigate the land, and you get that corresponds to biblical symbolism. Here too, the same thing. I can't see it from here, but anyway, there's somewhere there. I took this off the web. It's just a quick picture showing how the technology spread from Persia and across the world. And this is one of the most dance-like pictures. This is a woman working a water wheel, actually in Japan. This is not done in the Middle East. But I love the sort of combination of the umbrella and the wheel, and the stilts that she's using, or the crutches that she's using, as she goes round bringing up the water. The great Ivan Illich, who was a sort of cult figure in the 60s, wrote many polemical essays on education and war, pacifism, and health systems. And he was a kind of a bit like R.D. Lang, but a little bit less crazy. Anyway, Ivan Illich wrote a very, very interesting book on the politics of water production, and we have absolutely forgotten it. We've forgotten. We think it's. I mean, every time I now put on a tap, I'm sort of in an agony of anxiety that this is such a luxury that we're forgetting. The water in Damascus has been cut off now they only have it on for about an hour a day or something. It's just appalling. So some of the water guard, yes. But it was not only utility; it was absolutely pleasure for the Arab civilizations. And the whole idea of the arabesque is related to the decor, ornament, and fertility of these earthly paradises which they created. And in Palermo, they have restored two of them, a little bit brutally. This is a bit too brutal, I think. But you can see the water chutes, the water fountains that central to this. L'Azizza means the pretty one, the lovely one. So one of the summer palaces of the Arab rulers of Sicily in the early Middle Ages. And this is another one which has also been restored, but I put an engraving in because the engraving, currently it stands in a desert, but in the engraving you can see that it stood in a pool, and that's very characteristic. The uses of the ornamental sort of health-giving uses of water. And some of you may have been to the Alhambra, and you will know the remarkable beauty of the uses of water in what is an extremely hot and very dry part of Europe. So the Fountain of the Lions. Okay, so Cristina Iglesias was inspired by all these elements. I mean, I didn't talk to her about some of them, but when I saw her piece, and I realized that she had totally absorbed. I mean, or she lives there. She's got not in Toledo. She lives in Madrid, but she wanted to commemorate and create a piece that would actually capture some of this imagery and history for the town of Toledo now, because Toledo was the capital of Moorish Spain. I had not realized that it's quite far north, Toledo. I hadn't realized that Moorish Spain was ruled from the capital so far to the north. I think of Andalusia, I'm sure most of us think of Andalusia as being Seville or Granada. We think of it in the south, but actually Toledo is really quite far north. And in that town, in the early Middle Ages, there was a policy of tolerance under the Moors, so-called, and when there were different conquests until the 15th century, when Isabella and Ferdinand took over the Catholic queens, Catholic monarchs, there was a policy of convivencia. You probably heard this phrase, coexistence. It's not right to say that coexistence was always harmonious. It would be completely fallacious to claim that everybody lived, the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims lived in perfect understanding with one another, but the laws protected all religions. For 1494, date of great shame in Europe, the Jews and the Moors were either told they had to convert or they were expelled. So Cristina Iglesias wanted to find a way to talk about this moment of convivencia, of mutual understanding. And she thought of Toledo as the place she would make the piece when Archangel commissioned her to make something. And she realized, as when she walked around the town, that two things. One, that the town was entirely cut off from its river, that nobody went down there anymore. The whole of the river is actually ringed by ruins, most of which are watering places of one kind or another. Baths, the hammam, laundries, and bathing places, and that there had been a kind of separation, and it was because the river became very polluted and smelly at some point. It no longer is, but and so the towns just simply screened it off as if it wasn't there. So she decided she would make a piece that would bring the townspeople down to see their river again. And the first place, she made 3 fountains. She's made fountains before. The first fountain she made in the former arms factory. In order to make weapons, you need rushing water. You need to temper steel, you need rushing water. And Toledo blades were the absolutely most appreciated knives in Europe throughout the Renaissance. And this is where they were made. And there's a lot of mill races and the Tagus rushing through on these water wheels. And here in the Tower of Water, as it was called, she created a basin at the very bottom of the tower. So you go up the stairs inside, and you see down into this pool. Here you see the pool again. And the basin is cast from rotting matter. She's taken vegetation and she's arranged it. It's not a found heap. She's created a heap of rotting matter, of debris, foliage, and every kind of sort of branch and leaf, and she's cast it in bronze. And this is where we come back to water and the arabesque, because what she's saying here is that these organic forms, which of course have been restored to their non-geometric, casual, improvisatory shapes, no longer tethered so much by the tie or the bond, but simply dynamically, organically growing. They are caught at a moment of decomposition, and decomposition creates carbon, and it's carbon and water that are the ingredients of life. So she's created a piece that is a monument to the cycle of vegetation and resurrection and life, and it's couched in a kind of contemporary language that I would say was rooted in the Arabesque, not only in her thoughts about convivencia, but in the actual graphic look of these basins that she's cast in bronze. The second one, so that's the first one, it's a very magnificent, very large piece, and the water in the fountains pulses up almost imperceptibly. If you don't wait for quite a long time, you almost don't see it happening. You sometimes hear it happening. There's a sort of little bubble or a little prink or a little kind of squeak as the water comes bubbling up. But eventually, after the cycle is, I think, about 40 minutes, after about 40 minutes the pool is full, and it then turns into a reflecting pool. And then immediately it starts draining, also very, very slowly. So there is a kind of heartbeat, a very slow heartbeat, which gives you, again, a sense of contemplating an organic life cycle. The second one is the smallest one, and that's inside the convent of the Poor Clares, which is an enclosed order, and this is cut into the ground of one of their rooms, totally with filtered light, and beside it, again, the pool fills and drains very, very slowly. It's a space for contemplation. And it's screened off from the convent where the nuns are still living, not very many of them left, but where they're still living, by one of these screens. Not actually this screen, but this is an image of one of Cristina Iglesias' screens. And she's taken this directly from a form of Islamic furniture, the Masharabie shutters. Here's an example of them. And Giuliana Bruno, who's the sort of writer you might have had coming here, has written about these very beautifully, these screens. She says, perhaps Margarita and I can talk about it, and I can find the quotation later, because in Spanish they're called gelosías, which means jealousy, as they are in French, jalousie, and there are reasons that Giuliana Bruno talks about what this means about seclusion, privacy, invisibility, and general architectural ideas about separation. So and of course the space that is being separated, the space that is being rendered private by the screens is the female space. And they were used in the harems. Here's an Orientalist painting by John Frederick Lewis, using the Masharabie shutters in Cairo. Here's Cristina herself, installing the largest and most ambitious of all the three fountains that make up Tres Aguas, and it's in the main square of Toledo, in the Plaza del Ayuntamiento, below the cathedral, and in it you see the town hall from one side and the cathedral from the other side reflected. And again it goes up and down. Here it is with the water out. And I think there you can see probably more clearly in this photograph this sense of the branching, organic, almost animal-like energy that is still captured in the bronze. I haven't told you the plot of the dance piece because it's not yet finished, and in a sense it's more of a narrative, and I was trying here to give you a sense of the aesthetic and its symbolic undercurrent. Water, of course, gives us so many metaphors for many things. So now we can talk.
Marina, thank you so much. Is this good? Yeah. I mean, in a way, there are so many things that kind of was raised by this that I'm slightly have made lots of notes and also things from the past, from your work, that I was reminded of, that I'm almost not sure where to start. But, I mean, there are things that I suppose I was always interested in your work, which is this kind of creation of fiction, and also ideas of inscription and the arabesque as a kind of syntactical thing. And I think maybe it would be really good to actually go deeper into the arabesque, because I think, in a sense, it's such a complex term, and its generative capacity, I think, is really interesting. That thing you said about that if you didn't put a border around it, it would go on forever, which also made me think of the Baroque looping. So it's kind of this connection to the Baroque and this continuity and this thing that continues, which is the water wheel. So I suppose I was lucky enough, actually, because one of my students, Christina Kajana, who submitted her PhD a few years ago, wrote on the arabesque. And I was looking through her thesis again, and she talks about Oleg Grabar, the Islamic historian, who talks about the arabesque as a kind of creation of a new syntactic structure. So I just wonder if we could maybe expand.
Well, I'm very interested to
this.
hear what you sent me her thesis yesterday. But
it was just a lucky.
I haven't read it. I'm afraid not yet.
But this idea of the arabesque as the thing that actually generates content, the thing that generates both fiction and actuality, and kind of how you see it.
I think I would possibly start in a slightly different place, and that is that I think that the arabesque, one of the reasons that it hasn't been explored so much, and your PhD student is an exception, is because it actually carries a very strong Orientalist tinge. So that there's a sense in which it's rather Oscar Wilde and sort of Salome and kind of feelings of turning decorative, a lot of the pejorative end of aesthetics. So you have, as it were, decorativeness, lack of individuality, something greatly prized in Western aesthetics. This should be the signature of the master or mistress on the work. And this is actually a dissolution of that. It's in a sense of a kind of surrender to the geometric, to the abstraction. There is no. We don't have many. We have the names of calligraphers, but very few names of the masons or designers of the Alhambra. This is, of course, that's also true of medieval Europe, but to some extent. But nevertheless, there is here a subjugation of the idea of the individual soul and the individual creative. So there's a sort of how I would rescue it from Orientalism. I mean, I think those are two reasons. Yeah. Those are two reasons for the pejorative character. Ornament, always a problem. But secondly, I think also that it is actually, I think that esque ending is often a feminized ending. I mean, in the sense that it belongs to the picturesque. Grotesque, you might not say is feminized, but there's a kind of it's minor. I mean, it may be that because I'm the age I am, that I'm more sort of wedded to this idea of resisting the minor. I mean, retrieving the minor, recuperating the minor, because maybe now it's already changed so much. I mean, there's so much more appreciation of craft, of pottery, of embroidery, and so forth, than there used to be. But nevertheless, I think there is this sense of and the femininity is picked up definitely in dance, because though the arabesque is a male pose, it is not nearly so much of a male pose. I mean, it's a male pose in the handbooks, in the dance books, but it's not nearly so much of a main pose as it is for women. And and that slide that I showed you, which is where she, it's a lesson from the web, and she says, I will show you how to, do an audition, and you will, do the perfect arabesque. That is very, very gendered language. It's one woman talking to another woman about how to pass an audition well, and not necessarily for being a dancer, but for doing for being a ballerina, but for doing an showing her grace. So there's a way in which, what you could say about the syntactical, I'm very much thinking off the top of my head, but it's a very interesting thing to think about, what you said, is that I would say that it restores the idea of a flowing line, and that in some sense in some senses, that is a little bit of a resistance to Vitruvian man. So that what you're getting is not Leonardo's, concept, the humanist concept of the body in its circle, and it's a kind of very perpendicular, very vertical geometry. What you're getting is the body sinuously occupying a space, fully extended in different directions. And actually, you mentioned what did you mention? Sorry, you mentioned an aesthetic, not neoclassicism, but where you get the arabesque is, of course, in Hogarth's line of beauty.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, he really did develop it there.
But I was thinking this kind of the arabesque is actually something that doesn't have a centrality, so it doesn't have the humanist figure at the centre, and therefore it's kind of. I mean, sorry, I have Deleuzean references, but
that's fine,
they're kind of rhizomatic, so it's not the tree with the roots.
That's right. Yes,
it's something that meanders and constantly.
And in fact, you see that. Yes, and you see that. I mean, in this, but also in the Alhambra images, is that there really is no centre, nor is there any point of origin. It's not just a centre. There's no point of origin from which it is emerging. It is just a kind of replicating pattern, and that is where the affinity is with water. Though you may have the mother of the fallage, you may have the origin, the fount, the spring where the water comes out, but the shape of the water has no real origin. I mean, you can find the source of the Nile, you can find the source of the Thames as a sort of bubble, damp patch in a field. Not the Nile, but the Thames is a damp patch in a field. But it still doesn't have any form of the kind that is vertical, humanist, so forth. It is actually informe, if you want to use it. I mean, it is informe. So, and informe, as we've seen from discussions of it, has definitely, is the underside. Okay. So, and I think here she's using, she's exploring that. The idea of the underside, the sort of underbelly, the thing that sustains life but is not actually admitted, is not acknowledged.
And actually that goes back, which is really interesting, which is you talk about the women poets being literate. So in a sense, they had calligraphic skills. So the idea of inscribing something, the arabesque as a calligraphic skill, that they were somehow able to engage in that medium of writing, of the line flowing in a way.
Yes, well, it is extraordinary because one doesn't want to idealize this at all. They were extremely badly treated. I mean, by our standards and I mean the standards of human rights. I mean, they were bought and sold. Interestingly, the virginity was not so prized because they were bought and sold after they'd belonged to somebody. So they were exchanged as gifts. I mean, this was not freedom of any kind, but it is interesting that they were required, or they rose, they were the ones that were successful, who were therefore memorialized, were learnt to read and write. And these skills were passed on because they were survival skills by presumably women. I mean, there are little traces that the older women in the harem taught the younger women in the harem various things. But to go back to the idea of inscription, you've made me realize something about one of the poems that's written in the book. And that is that one of the women who endowed a public park on the banks of the Euphrates, there was a poem written to her by one of the other women, and it says, she has written a band of azure and gold on the river. And the bands of azure and gold were the bands that decorated clothes on which there would be inscriptions, praise inscriptions from the Quran. Okay, so this is it's actually there's a word for it, which is tiraz, I think. Anyway, so this is a particular form of embroidery with inscriptions, and her park becomes one of these embroidered ribbons that she's laid down.
So are these inscriptions almost, I mean, not talismanic, but do they activate something in a way, or how do they operate, these inscriptions? Do they have a purpose?
Well, I imagine, I don't know if these particular ones that are honorific have a talismanic function, but of course one of the most extraordinary areas of dress in the past, all the way up to 18th century Turkey, are the talismanic clothes, which I must say, I was when I first saw them, I couldn't believe them, especially as they were children's clothes. These Well, I went to an exhibition about, the first place I saw them was an exhibition about the court, the Ottoman ceremonial robes. And there were these shirts that are, they're made of cotton, and the cotton is covered in starch so that you can write in it. And then the entire surface of the shirt was entirely inscribed in prayers to protect the wearer. But the most moving one I saw was actually in the Institut du Monde Arabe, which was a child's shirt. And that was inscribed all over, also with these. They're not only taken from the Quran, they're also taken from prayers, sort of magical inscriptions. There are magic squares, which are like Sudoku. There are 9 squares that are, and various other forms of amuletic imagery. The feet of the Prophet, Solomon, the net of Solomon, various ways of noosing demons, keeping them out. And
so
also,
they're very functional.
Yeah, and also that's something I should have said about the forms of tiling, this form of tessellating the entire surface. And that is that it is related to this very prevalent, very, very widespread way that inscription works in religious cultures. And that is that it works as a kind of net to hold off demons, to hold off evil. I mean, you do get even examples in. And so something like the net of Solomon is a magic net which he devised, King Solomon the Wise devised, in which if you draw it, you can, make sure that your child. This will be a protection against the demons hurting your child. The demons, of course, are illness, death, lack of water, and so forth. I mean, this is just simply a way of symbolizing the harms that you fear will happen to your child. There are 2 very good examples in the British Museum of the Net of Solomon. They're Ethiopian, and they're in the room that goes from, they're Ethiopian. And and they're 19th century, they're not very early. But to go back to the density of arabesque is, I think, also in some senses amuletic. You are actually containing the order that is being imposed, and the implication of stretching out beyond is a way of keeping the chaos. So it's keeping the kind of chaotic forces stilled in some way.
But that's interesting, and that goes back to this kind of maybe the a kind of fear of Orientalism as a fearful kind of thing, which is this fear of chaos, the arabesque as being a chaotic force, something that spreads. And it's interesting because, this is a kind of slightly strange reference that some of the things you were talking about made me think, but the water and this, a slightly kind of flip side of this, it made me think of Gustav Meerbaum's Torture Garden, which is a sort of strange reference, but it's this idea of the garden as being the kind of the negative forces, and that book being written at the height of the Dreyfus affair, and a kind of vehement attack on colonialism, and actually the women there being these consumers. And it's a sort of very interesting thing.
I don't know the book, I'm afraid.
It's really interesting, actually, and it's
called Gustav.
It's Gustav Meerbaum, and it's the Torture Garden.
Meerbaum, yes. No, I wasn't correct.
And
I just I've tried.
Le Jardin des Supplices.
Yes.
And it's, of course, it's the novel. The book has been used culturally in all sorts of ways, but this idea of kind of attack on Orientalism, it's very interesting, actually, in that sense. And the garden being this place of violence, but also a place of consumption for the Westerner who comes to see it as this kind of horrific pleasure. It's a kind of dark satire, really.
I must read it, yes. It sounds, yes. Well, there are, the garden... though the earthly paradise is a garden, and though some of the women made gardens, I think there are ambiguities around gardens. There is a sense in which there a taming or a discipline going on. Perhaps that's what Meerbaum is. And actually now, I'm afraid that one of the polluting industries is gardening, because of the water wastage. Believe it or not, the tulip industry in Holland is one of the greatest dangers of water contamination because of all the nitrates they use to make the tulips bloom.
No, it's really, but also, well, tulips and repetition, and of course, I mean, this kind of, the arabesque is repetition. That's the other thing that made me think, this kind of, the notion of something being repeated, and whether that spreads to a kind of negative repetition or not. I don't know.
Well, I think that one of the reasons that the aesthetic seems to be, as it were, more noticeable now, I mean, that we respond to it, or I resonate with it, if you like, I feel it, is because actually repetition is a form of slowness. And slowness, which definitely these forms need slowness to absorb. I mean, Cristina Iglesias has definitely mined that side of it, but it's true of the Alhambra. I mean, I've been to the Alhambra twice, and I hope I will go before I die, because you really can't take it in. It's just too much, and it's too. And I think that slowness has become one of the kind of motors of contemporary desire when we confront the kinds of knowledge that we get through art or literature. I'm not saying always, of course, it would be a ridiculous generalization, but some of the artists who, are powerful for us now, speak very powerfully, require slowness. They require slow attention. They unfold slowly. And that's not just durational. That's not just time. It's that, I mean, I tried to see a Turel the other day, and, I didn't have enough time because it never materialized. My eyes did not get used to it sufficiently. It was a bright day in that house in Norfolk, where he has an extraordinary, very, very dark piece inside a dark room. And it may be also age that my eyes I just never saw it. I waited half an hour, I couldn't see it. So I mean, so that. But I think that he is a very powerful artist. And the other one, the other one in this same place, which is I can't remember what it's called, Holcombe Hall, is one of his sky chambers. And that, of course, is, and you lie on this wood and watch the sky, and it's a marvelous experience. But again, it's slowing down.
But, I mean, that kind of takes me back slightly to technology. And I know we sort of started speaking about this before before the talk, but one of the things that have always interested me in your writing kind of throughout and in the past is this idea of technology being a kind of anticipated fiction that is then actualized. So cinema becomes a sort of projection of the mind, or you talk about in Stranger Magic, you talk about the idea of flying in dreams, and then that's actualized through technology. And I just sort of wonder whether that aspect is present here, that this water distribution technology becomes a kind of magic where a solution, an actualization solution, is attempting to be found.
I think, it would be marvelous if that was so. I mean, in some senses, it's about forms of attention. And one of the things that happens to you when you're in Toledo after seeing Cristina's piece is that you become extremely aware that every pavement as you walk has got little manhole covers, often with a symbolic image of the Tagus on them, and also many, many hydrant plants and so forth. And that actually this mountain on which the city is dwelt is just completely underneath. There is this enormous hydraulic system, which is what she has tapped into to create her fountains. I mean, she's brought it up to the surface, and that was one of her ways of not only making people walk down to the arms factory and walk around the Tagus to look at her pieces, but also to bring them into consciousness of this underneath. So I suppose that's not answering your question about dreams. I will answer that in a minute. But I think in terms of this dance piece, though I don't want to be too didactic, and I do want it, it's obviously, I'm talking about it so much that it makes it didactic. It will be a dance piece with music. I mean, there may be some poems from the women's work, which I will translate. But but it won't be. There won't be a text. It's not going to be an argument. So it won't be didactic. But I would like it to freshen and quicken our sense of reciprocity and relationship to this treasure, which was, so vital and which so many millions of people do not have. I mean, one of the things that's driving the migration from Africa, not the migration from Syria, which is the war, but the migration from Africa, is the loss of the Sahara's traditional methods of husbanding the water. It's a very complicated story, but it's to do with war and to do with the ecology, of course. So that's why there's famine in Africa. So that's one. So that's one form of sort of vigilance, if you like. But on the question of dream, I mean, I suppose that I absolutely. My solution to the reason that the Arabian Nights became one of the most popular books in Enlightenment Europe. I thought, this is such a mystery, such a paradox. How could it be that people like Voltaire loved this book? What this farrago of fantastic stories. What on earth did they see in it? And people always said that it was just, an escapism. That the 18th century loved the book because it was escapist. Well, people don't sustain a great interest for that reason. I mean, it's usually because it matches experience. You're recognizing something. You're finding something you want to know. So it seemed to me that it was a very prophetic book about many conditions of modernity. Some of them rather wonderful, like flying, but others less wonderful, like fantastic money. The Arabian Nights is a book about fantastic money. There are numerous pyramid schemes, numerous Ponzi schemes.
Which is a kind of fictional construct.
Yes, numerous bankers producing money out of a hat and then it vanishes. I mean, it's a very, very modern book in that respect. And I wasn't the first person to notice this. I mean, Goethe loved the Arabian Nights. One of the things that he liked about it was the way it discussed money. I mean, he talks about that.
Yeah.
So I think that there are ways that, and I think it works two ways. The anticipation of advances by dream is prophetic in a possibly good way, but it's also active and shaping. So what we dream actually matters, because we are likely to, as it were, make it happen, I'm afraid. I mean, that is really, and so that's why I'm very drawn to the idea of the sacred word. I don't have any religious belief, but I think the fashioning, the speech act power, the performative power of the story made up of words actually does matter. It does matter what we say and what we think.
That's almost like kind of the idea of the golem as well,
yes,
where the
it
word
is absolutely
written and activated.
Yeah, and then his mouth is open and the scroll is put in his mouth.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's his soul. Yeah.
But that actually goes back to something that I really wanted to ask you about. Are we okay for time? Yeah. Which is that I was reading an interview with you, and you talk about, I'm just going to quote, so you talk about, I've got increasingly obsessed with the importance of books, poems and fictions which are never read in the original, which only exist in a sort of floating memory of different versions, different translations and transcriptions. And that goes back to which words do we hear, which versions of things do we hear. And in a sense, the kind of the unreliable narrator comes in, which is a fascinating notion anyway. But which words, which are the ones that we really kind of digest, if you like.
Well, yes, I mean, that would be a very interesting exercise, actually, to try. It's funny, because actually the novel I'm writing at the moment is in the form of a dictionary. And the word I'm sort of thinking, the word I was thinking I'm going to write about next is pompous, which was a sort of, it was a traumatic moment when my mother said to me, "Your father is pompous." And I didn't know what it meant, and I was and then I tried to find out, and it was obviously something very bad. So, I was upset by that, and I thought pompous. That's so I'm going to do these key words of things, but that's a slightly different point from the point of the stories, which are existing. I mean, one of the ways that stories continue to sort of keep their DNA is often through actual linguistic elements, or like Open Sesame. I mean, it is a linguistic element, but the sesame part is sort of, as it were, transmitted from the original, because it's the proper name of the seed. So, and in proper names as well. So, we know we know the Odyssey because we know Odysseus, and we know Circe. So these proper names actually then kind of give us pathways into these shared stories. And nonsense, actually things that don't mean anything, like proper names, they only signify the person, they don't actually mean anything else otherwise. They are kind of little fragments that are very, very important in terms of transmission.
But is that to do with recognition you're talking
like
about?
Like Rapunzel, for example.
Yeah.
Rapunzel is another example of the story keeping its DNA through her name and her connection to the herb, whatever that herb is. I mean, I've just been asked to write an introduction to a translation of Grimm's fairy tales illustrated by Kai Nielsen, the Danish illustrator from 1925. And the publishers, Folio, didn't know who the translator was. And I knew that if I put in an odd term, I would be able to track it on the web. And I found the edition, an anonymous translation of 1876, because Rapunzel is translated as radishes. And that is an extremely unusual translation for Rapunzel, that she wants to eat radishes. Okay. In almost every other version, she eats parsley or crow's foot, or, she doesn't eat radishes. And not only in this translation are they radishes, but they're also green. So I thought, green radishes, there can only be one book that has green radishes for this translation. So that's the sort of thing that, a child would remember that too. It's a very odd thing. So then the DNA would continue in this peculiar fashion. But I'm working on this in a totally other way, which I hope is going to work out, which is that I'm doing a project for refugees in the camps on stories. And we're trying to get past the linguistic barrier by various non-linguistic forms of communicating them. I could say more, but maybe it's a red herring. It's a diversion at the moment. But some of that is music, nonsense words, and proper nouns, and so because these are the sort of structural elements of the stories. Okay.
Should we open this to the floor? I mean, there's just one. I'm gonna.
yes.
Just one thing to do with stories, which is that I think it just to bring it back to the arabesque, and that's this question of weaving, and obviously like Penelope's thread and the lace, and you talk about again in this wonderful book, Stranger Magic, you talk about the kind of shadow puppets. Shadow play and lace, and this idea of something that kind of spreads and weaves, and the line that continues. And in the images of the ballet scores, of course, it is a kind of line and a kind of lace. So this sort of threading and weaving is, I think, very interesting as an image, anyway, that seems to continue in your writing and in the work.
Yes, and it connects, of course, to this idea of the minor art that actually shouldn't be minor.
Yeah.
And that has been, but because it has been, it's labelled minor partly because it has been dominated by women. Not exclusively. I mean, I think some men, have. I mean, there are some countries in which carpets are woven by men, but this tapestry work is very heavily imprinted with female art, and again with anonymity on the whole. Name a famous lace maker,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
But anyway, but also you're right, of course, that it's a metaphor for narrative, and one of the things I didn't talk about, because dance pieces don't really have narrative in quite the same way as a novel or fiction, is that the arabesque is a form of branching narrative as well, and that the Arabian Nights is probably one of the great examples of an embedded one story inside another story, and constantly generative, as your word, a very good word, constantly, as it were, overflowing, and also capable of renewal. I mean, you can put another story into the Arabian Nights and nobody would notice. You're not destroying its integrity. You can't really put, well, you could put a zombie into Jane Eyre, but we recognise that as sort of as incongruous, and we enjoy it for that reason. But but you can, you know, put any number of stories into the Arabian Nights. It would be quite hard to, as it were, to destroy the integrity of the book by continuing in its own style. And that's the same with the tiling.
Yeah.
You can continue.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we should open it to the floor if there are any questions or thoughts. Ruth.
Hello, thank you very much. That's really amazing. I was just thinking about, it's not really exactly a question, it's just a thought that occurred to me, which was the relationship between sort of technology, and I was thinking of film and dance and the arabesque. That dance, the dance arabesque that's not the ballet dance arabesque, but say the Busby Berkeley film with the patterns unfolding, and because it's very much a kind of also the play with light and pattern and and movement and no centre or. Anyway, that's all. I just wondered whether that was something that was you were interested in, or that was going to inform the, I don't know, the choreography or something.
I haven't looked at a Busby Berkeley film for a long time, but you're quite right, because that also, I mean, one of the things that we didn't mention is the closeness to digital reproduction. This has got definite, the arabesque has definite connections to sort of the generation of fractal imagery, for example, constantly replicating. And Busby Berkeley's got that as well, but there's usually a centre, isn't there? There's usually a sort of overflowing of the from the centre of the flower. It's certainly in the geometric range rather than in the organic this range of the arabesque. The film that is the artist's film that is very close to a lot of this, including slowness, is Craneway Event by Tasta Dean, where she filmed Merce Cunningham before he died, directing his group of dancers in a kind of very light-filled dance performance space. And these endless looping. Oh yes, I didn't mention that one of the first uses of arabesque in dance actually is about a chain of dancers crossing the stage. So there's an element of the sequence.
Maya Deren as well.
Yes, Maya Deren.
The film with,
yes. I think that would be very interesting, fruitful, very interesting. Because it's connected also to optical instruments like kaleidoscopes.
Exactly. The other thing about the arabesque is that in ballet, you know, when you're taught it, it's it's static. It's utterly static. It's not although it's like a plie. It's not like a plie actually, but a plie is on the way to doing something else, and often the arabesque is like the end of something, or
full stop,
or it's a sort of full stop, or the comma, or the wait there, and you lift it off.
Well, it's an attitude, isn't it, that you hold? But of course, but I suppose what I was trying to say is that the attitude in itself implies extension. So though it is stilled, I mean, it does have that in common with these patterns. I mean, they aren't moving.
No, absolutely.
And actually, one of the things that I talk about in the essay on Cristina Iglesias is that she's using lost wax here. So she's casting by a method that is intrinsically organic. I mean, profoundly organic, but in order to produce something which doesn't change. So that, in a sense, also has a relationship with what you were saying, you know, that this is the appearance of something that implies extension, movement, and vitality, but actually it's inert.
I suppose film itself, the film strip itself, is a kind of arabesque. Hence, animation is also a kind of arabesque. But Aura.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed that, and I was really intrigued actually by something you just said now in relation to the digital. And it seemed to me like, in a way, you were identifying two types of arabesque. One which is very ordered, mathematical, structured, repetitive, and the other which is a tangle, a chaos, a kind of disintegration almost, which I think this piece maybe seems to be more within that spectrum. And I was thinking as you were talking in relation to the digital of Laura U. Mark's writings. I don't know if you've come across her.
Entangled, absolutely.
Very good Enfoldment
book.
and
yes, amazing, yes. Yes.
And her reading of Islamic art forms and kind of an iconic representation in relation to the digital.
Yes.
And that made me think more along the lines of this other more chaotic form as something glitching. Something glitching, something kind of actually, rather than being kind of repetitive and structured, and there was a phrase you used here, endless correspondence.
Yeah, that's Regal's.
That it seems to be a different kind of arabesque, which is about dissolution and glitch, if you think of it.
Yes. Entropic almost.
Yes. Actually, the Regal quotation where I found it is criticized for not actually taking in exactly what you just said about the. It says Regal also pointed out the arabesque has infinite correspondence, meaning that the design can be extended indefinitely in any direction. Regal's analysis is the basis for most later art historical descriptions of arabesque. And then later it says, some such designs are turned inward at their edges, limiting their extensibility. So I probably overdid it. I mean, you're right that there is. Yeah, you're right that there's a kind of admission of entropy. There can be an admission of entropy. I think in the places like the Alhambra, where there's a kind of desire to express the infinite plenitude of God, you're not getting that. But there is an aspect of the arabesque where you do get that. But actually, on that book, that Mark's book, Laura Marx, she, I thought that the stuff about Islamic was absolutely marvelous. Actually, I'd forgotten it when I was writing this, but I thought that the digital stuff was not so good. I don't know what you thought. I thought the digital art didn't hold up the argument. It wasn't good enough somehow.
There are definite kind of flaws in some of her writing, but it seems very close actually to the area you're looking at also in her writings on the haptic. Like I think this idea of the kind of Islamic patterning in relation to the haptic.
I must look at it again,
Actually in relation to Maya Deren and Meshes, even just as a kind of formal connection, but there's something there as well.
Yes.
It's not really specifically related to this, but more something you kind of just ended on about the feminine aspects of craft and how it's that like the sort of feminine aspects become a key part of something becoming minor, and you were specifically talking about or referencing craft, and I was thinking about the resurgence of clay in fine arts, sculpture at the moment, and about how possibly it's become more accepted because men have taken it up as a medium. And
well,
whether you've maybe had a thought
I don't
on
know.
that.
I think we don't have to be that pessimistic. Sorry, have you finished?
Yeah.
Sorry. I don't think we have to be that pessimistic. I think really, actually, Helen Chadwick, who there's going to be an event tomorrow at the ICA, was very instrumental in. I mean, she's one of the artists who has been instrumental in recuperating and affirming this kind of haptic, to use Laura's word, haptic relationship with materials and with processes, and Phila de Barlow is a superb example. I mean, of an astonishing use of, monumental on a scale of huge size. So it's not, in that sense, is major, very major in scale, but it's very, it's extraordinarily successful use of rough materials and the sense of the hand in it and the improvisatory and the sense of mess and trash and actually the one I saw in Edinburgh I thought was an extraordinary meditation on the refugee camps. I don't know if she means that, but they had all these lookout points and ladders and walls and surveillance and blockage, and you couldn't get through and things were falling down, and it seemed to me a marvellous piece of work, actually, really beautiful. And so I'm really pleased she's doing the British Pavilion in Venice. But so I think that the language of some of the arts that used to be considered, as it were, not fine, unrefined, has been successfully revisioned and reclaimed through a lot of women artists. And the boys are just imitating them.
Good to hear.